They say the Middle Ages were an age of iron and fear, when faith ruled, kings commanded, and women were kept under lock and key, sometimes quite literally. The image is unforgettable. A cold iron belt, secured with a padlock, biting into the flesh of some unfortunate noblewoman, condemned to live in misery until her husband returned from war. It is an idea that has haunted books, films, and even museum displays for centuries. But was it ever real? Or is the chastity belt one of history's most enduring lies? Tonight, we open the vaults of the past, sift through rusted iron and darker imaginations, and uncover the truth behind forced chastity in the medieval world and the myths that shaped it. The legend begins not with a cold reality, but with words written by poets and moralists rather than blacksmiths. In the late Middle Ages, as knights marched off to the Crusades, a story took hold. According to the tale, jealous husbands locked up their wives with metal belts, fitted with cruel spikes, to keep them pure until their victorious return. These stories were written in Italian and French verse, tinged with humor, and carried an unmistakable warning that women were to be watched, guarded, controlled. But were such belts actually forged in workshops? The earliest references to chastity belts are not in legal records or inventories but in satirical poems. By the 15th century, artists carved playful depictions of knights handing keys to worried wives or bumbling guards. These illustrations were jokes, medieval memes, not blueprints for real devices. Even so, the fear they represented was not a joke. Medieval society, steeped in Christian morality, placed a heavy burden on female virtue. A woman's honor was her family's honor. Her chastity was a treasure to be guarded, not by iron, but by strict social rules, relentless surveillance, and the ever-present threat of shame. To understand why the myth of the chastity belt spread, you have to step into the medieval mind. This was an age of arranged marriages, when alliances between families mattered more than love. A noble daughter was a pawn on a political chessboard. If she bore a child outside wedlock, the scandal could ruin dynasties. Church leaders preached constantly about the dangers of female sexuality. Women were often blamed for tempting men into sin, echoes of Eve in the Garden of Eden. Theologians warned that female desire must be tamed, fenced in, subdued. So while iron belts may have been rare, or even non-existent, the idea of locking up women reflected a real cultural obsession. Husbands, fathers, and priests tried to control behavior through curfews, convents, moral sermons, and public humiliation. In Florence and Venice, young women from wealthy families were often cloistered indoors, guarded by older female relatives. In England, city laws fined or whipped women accused of adultery. Across Europe, markets displayed scold's bridles and shame masks, devices designed not to restrain passion, but to humiliate those who defied social expectations. The chastity belt may have been a myth, but the fear that gave rise to it was very real. What about those iron contraptions in museums, the ones with cruel locks and razor-sharp teeth? Surely they prove chastity belts were real? The truth is stranger than the legend. Many belts displayed in the 18th and 19th centuries as medieval artifacts were fakes, made during a time when collectors had an appetite for the macabre. Renaissance curiosity cabinets loved to exhibit instruments of vice and virtue, even if they had to be fabricated. Modern historians have examined these devices carefully. The metalwork is often far too refined, closer to 19th century craftsmanship than medieval forging. Some were clearly made for traveling sideshows or as warnings against lust, not for actual use. Others were dangerous to wear even for minutes, let alone months. Were there any real chastity belts? Possibly, but not in the way legends suggest. Some 16th and 17th century records describe moral belts or modesty belts, likely worn by courtesans to protect themselves against assault or by women during travel to deter attackers. These were not permanent prisons but temporary protections. They were rare, isolated, and not a tool of systematic control. In other words, the image of knights locking up wives before crusades belongs more to Gothic fantasy than to medieval fact. If not metal belts, how did medieval society enforce chastity? The answer lies not in iron, but in fear. Shame was a weapon sharper than any spike. Public punishment for sexual misconduct was brutal, but aimed at reputation, not anatomy. Adulterers were paraded through streets in rags. Women accused of infidelity had their hair cut short as a mark of dishonor. Sometimes they were forced to ride backwards on donkeys while crowds jeered. In German cities, shame boards displayed drawings of scandalous women to ruin their names forever. Men, too, were punished, but women bore the harsher weight of social control. A man's affair might be mocked as mischief. A woman's was treated as treason against family and faith. This constant pressure to remain pure made the idea of a chastity belt plausible, even if the reality was thin. The myth itself reflected how medieval culture viewed women's bodies, as property to be guarded, locked away if necessary. If chastity belts were so rare, why do we imagine them as symbols of the Middle Ages? The answer lies not in medieval times, but in the centuries that followed. During the Renaissance and Enlightenment, Europe looked back on the Middle Ages as a dark age, brutal, superstitious, and absurd. Scholars and collectors loved to display grotesque relics to prove how far civilization had come. Iron belts with wicked teeth appeared in museums as proof of medieval ignorance. In the Victorian era, chastity belts became a subject of morbid fascination. Moral reformers, obsessed with sexual purity, used the idea to warn against vice. Erotic novelists, on the other hand, used them to fuel scandalous fantasies. By the 19th century, chastity belts had transformed from moral cautionary tales into symbols of forbidden desire. The irony is sharp. A device supposedly made to suppress lust became an object of lustful imagination. Whether real or not, the chastity belt has become a powerful symbol, not of medieval ironwork, but of control. It represents the deep, centuries-long anxiety about women's independence, sexuality, and honor. Even today, the myth lingers in movies, cartoons, and Halloween costumes. But behind the joke lies a warning. For much of history, women's bodies were not their own. They were guarded, shamed, and regulated by fathers, husbands, and priests who believed virtue could be enforced like a lock. The true medieval chastity belt was invisible. Rigid social expectations, enforced by fear of public disgrace. Iron was rarely needed when shame worked so well. Many of the chastity devices preserved in museums today raise serious questions. Some appear so crude and impractical that experts doubt they were ever meant to be worn. Rusted iron belts with jagged edges, oversized locks, and bizarre hinges would have caused injury within hours, not weeks. Their very design suggests that they were not protective devices at all, but rather props of imagination or tools of fear. In the 19th century, as Europe rediscovered its medieval past with equal parts horror and fascination, craftsmen began forging antique chastity belts to satisfy collectors and traveling exhibitions. These so-called artifacts were paraded before paying crowds as proof of medieval savagery. Many were outright fakes, produced not in the Middle Ages, but in Parisian workshops or Viennese foundries. Their purpose was to shock, not to secure. Yet myths persist because they fit a powerful narrative. That medieval husbands routinely locked away their wives to preserve honor and fidelity. The reality is far murkier. Records of actual enforcement are scarce, and most references appear centuries later, in moral treatises or satirical works. Some belts were likely ceremonial, presented as tokens of control or threats rather than practical restraints. Symbolism, after all, can wound as deeply as iron. But even if the hardware was rare or symbolic, the idea it represented was chillingly real. Women's bodies in the medieval world were often treated as territory to be defended, property to be guarded. Legal codes in parts of Europe explicitly tied female chastity to male honor, meaning an accusation of infidelity or impurity could ruin not just a woman's life, but her entire family's standing. Whether or not belts were truly worn, the threat of forced chastity hovered in the cultural imagination like a locked door at the end of a dark hall. Meanwhile, in Renaissance and early modern Europe, new kinds of devices appeared not for wives but for daughters. Manuals warned parents of moral corruption and wandering desires. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Some doctors even prescribed chastity devices to prevent what they believed were dangerous excesses of the body. These were not massive belts of iron but smaller contraptions, cages, plates, and spiked rings, designed to stop intimate contact. Unlike the medieval myths, these devices were documented, patented, and occasionally sold by medical suppliers. The obsession with controlling desire had evolved, but it had not disappeared. And it wasn't only women under suspicion. Men, too, were subjected to restraints. Some devices for boys and young men were fitted with painful teeth or spikes, intended to punish any sign of arousal. The belief that physical pleasure led to illness, madness, or moral decay drove a small but disturbing industry. So when people dismiss chastity belts as mere legend, they overlook this later chapter, one that was less about knights and castles and more about doctors and parental fear. Still, the image of the iron belt remained fixed on the Middle Ages, a convenient villain for modern storytellers. Writers in the Enlightenment mocked medieval barbarism, pointing to chastity belts as proof of ignorance. In the Victorian era, illustrated books depicted imprisoned maidens suffering under locked metal straps, even as real devices of control were quietly marketed in Europe and America. The myth was too good or too dark to die. But what do we actually know? Surviving texts give us clues. 14th century Italian poetry mentions belts of chastity as jokes or metaphors, not legal instruments. A few inventories of noble estates list iron girdles, though whether they were symbolic or practical is unclear. The first detailed descriptions of chastity belts as everyday tools appear much later, written by authors already removed from the medieval period they describe. In short, the evidence for widespread medieval use is paper-thin. Modern historians have re-examined the most famous museum pieces. Many show signs of machine tooling from centuries after the Middle Ages. Others include locks and hinges that didn't exist until the Renaissance. Even those few examples that might date to the 15th century look ceremonial, too ornate and impractical for prolonged wear. It is more likely that belts were used in isolated cases, as punishment, as cruel jokes, or as theatrical symbols of control, rather than as a standard marital practice. And yet, the myth has power precisely because it feels plausible. In an age of arranged marriages, strict codes of honor, and limited rights for women, it is not hard to imagine a husband who would want such a device. The fear it represents, that women's bodies must be guarded at all costs, is firmly grounded in history. Whether the locks were literal or metaphorical, the mentality was real. Today, chastity belts often appear in pop culture as relics of medieval absurdity. Films and cartoons treat them as comic props. But the truth is far more unsettling. These devices, whether myth, threat, or reality, were always about control through fear. Even if a belt never touched a living body, its very idea told women they were never fully free. The most chilling lesson is not about iron, but about imagination. You do not need to lock someone in chains to make them feel imprisoned. A whispered threat, a story told to daughters, a key kept on a father's ring. These can build cages just as strong as steel. The chastity belt, whether forged in a medieval smithy or a 19th century collector's shop, symbolizes how power shapes even the most private corners of human life. By the 20th century, as scholarship grew sharper, many chastity belts were exposed as frauds or later inventions. Museums quietly relabeled exhibits. Historians traced the legends back to Renaissance satire or Victorian moral panic. And yet, the myth never fully died. The idea is too dramatic, too haunting, a symbol of the deep human urge to control love, loyalty, and the body itself. So what do we make of this strange, shadowed legacy? Perhaps the chastity belt is best understood not as a common medieval tool, but as a mirror of fear, fear of women's independence, fear of desire, fear of betrayal. Whether real or imagined, it became a story men told about themselves. That honor was fragile, that fidelity must be forced, that trust alone was never enough. The next time you see an iron belt displayed behind glass, ask yourself, was this truly locked around someone's waist? Or was it locked around our collective imagination? In either case, the lesson is clear. When societies try to control desire through fear, they often reveal more about their own anxieties than about the people they seek to restrain. And perhaps that is why the myth still lingers. Not because it tells us what really happened in the Middle Ages, but because it warns us what humans are capable of believing and doing in the name of honor and control.